Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We are now at the point, as we concluded our last lecture, where Athens' future is in Solon's hands. And so in the first part of this lecture, I want to talk briefly about Solon, the man, the legislator, and then afterwards I want to turn to his actual reforms, and then we'll move on from there. Solon was made extraordinary archon in 594 BC to bring an end to the civil war and to fix the problems that had plagued Athenian society, problems that we have talked about endlessly. Most of our information about Solon comes from the document known as the Athenian Constitution, which we have talked about already, and also from Plutarch's biography of him. Both of these works quote extracts from his lyric poetry, and he wrote quite a bit of this. That's really interesting because it underlines the fact that prose was not the medium of communication in those days, but rather poetry. So it shows us just at what an early point in society we are. Prose will be a later addition, later kind of innovation, as it were. A surprising one for us, I think, that is the order, but nevertheless, that is the case. Solon wrote poetry before he became archon, and in this poetry, he speaks his mind about the problems that were happening in Attica. This would have brought his name to the attention of everyone, and it perhaps explains why he was given this extraordinary power and not others, as we mentioned at the close of our last lecture. He also wrote poetry after his legislation, explaining what he had done, and especially why. So the fragments of his poetry that we don't have all of his poetry. We've only a number of fragments, but nevertheless, they are very important, gives us a unique insight into what Solon thought was wrong, who was to blame, and how he decided he was going to fix things. Solon has to be one of the most important people in Western history, perhaps even in world history, because, as he is commonly called, he was the father of democracy. Certainly, among ancient Greeks, he took on a legendary status. In later Greek tradition, he became one of the seven sages or wise men of Greece. And as the classical period wore on, a number of laws were attributed to him to give them some sort of pedigree, like if Solon introduced this law, it must be good, we have to follow it. And therein lies a problem for the ancient historian, separating the historical Solon from the legendary as far as his laws go. And we will address this problem as we work through what Solon did and what was ascribed to him. Now, as I said, Solon's poetry fortunately tells us a lot about what he did and why he did it. And he makes it very clear that he was personally hurting from the civil war. He vividly describes this when he writes, for instance, "My heart inside me is in agony as I look on Ionia's oldest land being slain." This is very vivid imagery. My heart inside me is in agony as I look on Ionia's oldest land being slain. Solon tells us that for him, the rich were to blame for the civil distress, and he condemns their selfishness. He also recognizes what each side wanted him to do. The aristocrats wanted some sort of return to the status quo ante, that is, the civil war to be ended and no more threat of tyranny. The hoplites, for their part, that middle stratum of society, as I've described it, they wanted some voice in politics. They wanted some access to political office. And the mass of people, well, they wanted everything. They wanted a cancellation of debts, they wanted land redistribution, and they thought that these things would solve all their problems. In the poetry of Solon that he wrote after his legislation, he talks about what he did to ensure that the, quote, many bad rich men, and that is his phrase, the, quote, many bad rich men, end quote, should not have equal share in the land with the, quote, many poor good men, end quote. So many bad rich men and many poor good men should not have an equal share in the land. This is interesting because it shows us, I think, that he never intended that these two sides would have an equal share of land. In other words, he never intended to redistribute the land really at all, or at least not in equal radical proportion, redividing everything. He never intended to parcel it out in equal shares among everyone, as the people apparently wanted him to do. So he was never going to do this. And this would, in fact, anger them, that is, the many poor good men. Nevertheless, he was going to champion the poor at the expense of the aristocrats. And this is very similar to what tyrants elsewhere had done. And I want to bring in those rulers deliberately now, those other tyrants, to show the sort of power that Solon now wielded. Because in essence, he wields a power that is in some ways tantamount to a tyrant, but he himself was not a tyrant. He was a legitimately appointed officer of the state. He tells us that if he wanted to, he could have become tyrant, actually. He could have wielded that power in an absolute sense and without any term limit, as it were. But instead, he chose to suffer the wrath of both sides of society, both rich and poor, because he wanted to act only in the city's best interests. And so he does something. He does some of the things that all the strata of society, the poor, the middle, and the upper classes wanted him to do, but he doesn't do everything that they want him to do. So it is a genuine compromise because everybody, in a sense, walks away unhappy. Nobody is totally satisfied. Solon tells us that he was not prepared to pander completely to any one side of society. He tells us that he saw himself as a mediator, placing every member of society where he considered that person should fit, and his legislation was to remedy what he considered to be wrong. He knew this was going to make him unpopular, but he didn't worry about that because he was working in the best interest of Athens. He wrote in his poetry about his unpopularity. He actually says the following in another quote, "Now they are angry with me. Everyone looks at me with suspicion as if I were their enemy." And by everyone, of course, he means all members of society. So that is the man. That is the legislator. Let us consider Solon's legislation in and of itself. What did he do exactly? Well, he passed a number of measures, and these can be divided into the economic, the political, and the judicial. And I would like to consider each one of these in turn. His economic legislation feeds into his social legislation. The two are really married together. And so the rest of what I'll be talking about in this opening part of the lecture will deal with his economic and social legislation. And then afterwards, we will discuss his political and judicial measures, and then we'll kind of sum up comments and conclude our discussion of Solon, and we'll move on to the tyranny that does ultimately take hold in Athens. The chief complaint of the people was their being enslaved, despite being citizens. Remember, we're talking here about all the people of Attica. Remember that when Athens became the polis of Attica, those who lived throughout Attica took on Athenian citizenship. And so we're not just talking about the citizens in the city of Athens, but all of Attica. When the hectemeroi, remember those are those six parters, those six sharemen, couldn't repay their debts, the aristocrats seized their lands. We know about this from last time. And then they marked off those lands that they had seized by what were called horoi, okay, the singular horos, the plural horoi. These were set up around the land to show that the person farming that land did not own it anymore. It belonged to someone else. If I were to make a modern analogy, one might think of, I don't know, like one of those posters that you see outside of a house that's for sale, that sells, Wells Fargo owns the mortgage to this house or something like that. Now, this is something, obviously, it's kind of a crude analogy, but that is something of like what it's going on here, that this property is now no longer owned by the person who was living on it. Well, this is definitely what was going on in Attica. And imagine how the people must have felt to be farming land that was once their own. They were once unencumbered occupants of it, but now it belonged to someone else, and they were still farming it, and it was, but nevertheless, it was no longer theirs. They were kind of like serfs on the territory, and it was surrounded by these horoi for all and sundry to see. So this is a massive humiliation. Also was the dire and chronic lack of food, because as crops continued to fail, or there was simply not enough to feed a family, a farmer would again turn to these aristocratic neighbors / overlords for help, and this time with no other land to put up for collateral or for bargaining, they would pledge their own bodies, either of themselves or of their family, as collateral. And we know that this occurred. We know that if the farmer then defaulted a second time, he and his family could be sold off as slaves. And this enslavement was bitterly resented, And the horoi, these stones, came to be seen as a symbol of serfdom, basically. That's why the people believed, and certainly we can understand this, that their only hope lay in a cancellation of their debts and for land redistribution. Solon's economic legislation worked on two levels to combat this, on the individual level and on the city level. As far as the individual is concerned, the ordinary person, Solon placed a ban on all future loans secured on one's actual person. In other words, you could no longer put up your body as collateral. And that meant that the poor never again could become slaves or be sold as slaves by their fellow citizens. In tandem with this, Solon enacted a widespread cancellation of debts. And this cancellation of debts has a wonderful name. It is called the Syzakthaia, the shaking off of burdens. That is literally the word seismos in Greek means an earthquake, so you have the idea of shaking there, and then akthos would mean something like a burden. So in this case, debt. So the people literally shook off their burdens, and the Athenian Constitution tells us about this. It tells us this word. That's how we know it. By canceling debts, Solon made these farmers unburdened again. In other words, their lands were returned to them, and the horoi, those symbols of land dispossession of serfdom, were removed. He dug them up and chucked them away, actually. He actually even describes this in his poetry because he writes, quote, "Black earth from which I uprooted the horoi that were embedded in many parts of you. The earth is now free where previously it had been enslaved." He even did his best to bring back home some of the people who had been sold off into slavery further afield. He writes again in a different fragment of his poetry, "I brought back many people who were sold, some unjustly, others justly, and some who had been forced to flee, who did not speak their own Athenian language anymore." This passage is very interesting because it shows us that some farmers had fled. They hadn't been sold as slaves. They just simply got the heck out of there, presumably to avoid having their families and themselves split up and sold off as slaves. We've talked before about how abysmal the situation must have been. If one could close your eyes and go back into that time and actually imagine what it must have been like, it must have just been really dreadful. In this case, Solon is in some ways, giving himself a pat on the back, showing how he has tried to fix this. He is commemorating his own deeds and trying to end this most difficult of social problems. Now, that also, but letting that issue to the side now, there was another problem of the food shortage. The grain that was grown in Attica was not enough to support the population because of the relative infertility of the soil, as I've mentioned before. The Athenians would always be dependent upon imported grain, and this principally came from the Black Sea region, that is southern Ukraine, where things grow very readily. The soil is very, very good for growing there. However, there was some grain grown in Attica, but the nobles were selling it overseas for a hefty profit. This reminds one, if you've ever studied the potato famine in Ireland of the 19th century. A very similar situation happened there, where there was food being produced in Ireland. Yes, there was the potato blight, obviously, but the British overlords were taking the food that was not potatoes, that was grain of other types, or whatever the case may be, what that was grain, and we're selling it at a profit overseas, either back in England or around their empire. Something similar here is going on here. And so to combat this, Solon banned the export of all natural produce apart from olive oil. So whatever little grain was grown in Attica now stayed there. It wasn't enough to feed the entire population, but even that little bit better, being present was better than nothing. And as I mentioned before, Solon did not redistribute the land, even though the people wanted this. He was never going to do this because he knew that it wouldn't solve the agrarian distress. If the people simply had bigger chunks of land, so what? Things like bad harvests and other natural disasters, and simply the infertility of the soil, all those things would not go away just because simply you had more land. So the economic problems that dogged the Athenians in the first place were not going to abate simply by getting more land. But the question was what to do with the land then. And Solon had an idea about using the land for what it could grow rather than what it could not. Well, apart from a meager amount of grain, the farmers were growing a limited supply of olives, grapes, and figs. And Solon now encouraged them to grow in increased quantities olives. Olives are a very hardy crop. They virtually grow on cement. I'm exaggerating, but they need very minimal looking after, and they can grow in very rocky soil. And that is why they would absolutely be perfect and flourish in the poor quality soil of Attica. There already was some olive oil being made in this time in Athens, but not in any serious quantity. So Solon's plan was to stimulate the production of olive oil and turn it into an export product that would ultimately benefit the farmers and the city. On top of that, it would help to pay for the much needed imported grain. Unfortunately, the farmers resisted this change. And if we can just skip ahead half of a century, where I'm going to end the lecture tonight, to the tyrant Pisistratus, he would actually force the farmers to switch to olive cultivation, and we will and we will look into that. It was definitely a very prescient move on Solon's part. Within a generation or so, towards the end of the 6th century, ultimately, when you do get to Pisistratus's tyranny, Attica was virtually covered with olive trees, and they produced such high quality olives that the land became very prosperous for small farmers, and olive oil would play a staple part in the Athenian economy ever afterwards. In fact, even to this very day, Greek olive oil is probably the best one can buy, and it goes right back to this time. We can trace these economic changes, this economic growth, all the way back to Solon in the beginning of the 6th century. So no land redistribution. That would have gone down very badly, I think, with the ordinary people, for obvious reasons, because they wanted it. But his other measures must have delighted them. Imagine having one's debts canceled just like that overnight. We don't really even have to imagine it. It's something that is being bandied around in the halls of our own legislature on a federal level, even right now. The idea of getting rid of college debt. It's a big problem, and as you can see, it has been the problem of debt has been around for a very, very long time indeed. But just think of how much the people would have rejoiced at the idea of the Syzaktheia, of the shaking off of burdens. We can actually get a glimpse of that because they even named a religious festival after it, where they would celebrate it every year because they were so happy about it. At the same time, Solon's measures must have angered the aristocrats terribly. They now lost all of that land that they had been accumulating, or rather seizing, from the defaulting farmers by having the horoi being taken away. And to make matters worse, the Syzaktheia meant that they wouldn't get any of their debts repaid. So they were losing out big time, and it's hardly a surprise then that he upset both sides of society by his legislation. As for the city itself of Athens, if we move away now from how Solon benefited the individual and move on to the city level, Solon introduced a law that fathers were to have their sons taught a trade. The idea being behind this that skilled workers would contribute to the city's overall growth. How would you enforce such a law like this, I hear you ask? Solon put the pressure on parents with the stipulation that if they did not ensure that their sons were taught a trade, then those sons were legally no longer responsible to look after them, that is, the parents, in old age. Of course, there was no welfare state in ancient Greece, or anywhere for that matter, until modern times. So no retirement benefits, no social security in Athens or anywhere in Greece. And as parents became old and infirm, the law that their children were to take care of them, otherwise they would be out on the street. This was a law that came into being. Some children, no doubt, would do this automatically. Some children would automatically take after their parents, to look after them, and they wouldn't need a law to tell them this. But obviously others saw looking after their parents as a burden, financially as well as physically. So they must have tried to wriggle out of it, and that's why the law itself came into being. Why else would you have a law to protect parents unless some children tried to wriggle out of looking after them? So Solon's law here played on those parents who might otherwise allow their children to do nothing or anything. They didn't care, knowing that they would automatically be looked after in old age. Now that wouldn't be automatic anymore if the kids could do as they pleased. In other words, they now had to ensure that their sons were taught a trade, because if they didn't, their sons were not legally indictable if they kicked the parents out onto the street. It must have happened, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have a law to prevent it. So Solon did that and put pressure on parents to encourage, mandating that the parents teach their sons a trade. Solon also encouraged foreign craftsmen, potters especially, to move to Athens, and he offered them citizenship to lure them there. He knew that if there was an increase in olive oil production, pots would be needed to store the oil and to export it as container vessels. The clay of Attica is actually very good for pots, and there were already potters in Athens, even before Corinth cornered the pottery market, thanks to the Kypselid tyrants, which we talked about in our previous lecture. Attic geometric pottery was the best in Greece. Many foreign potters did move to Athens, and they settled in a quarter of the city that became known as the Keramaikos, which you see in front of you right now. And yes, that is the origin of our word ceramics. Okay, ceramic from the Keramaikos, the quarter where the potters made their pots. And you can still visit it to this day, as you see here. Since the Athenians guarded their citizenship jealously, as most societies throughout history have done, with the exception of really Rome and the United States, Solon's move was a rather radical one, actually encouraging foreigners to come and work in Athens and give them citizenship. But this actually did the trick. It lured a lot of artisans and a lot of craftspeople to come to Athens and to start working there, with this promise of citizenship was seen as a desirable one. The document, the Athenian Constitution, also tells us that Solon made changes to the city's coinage and its system of weights and measures. And here we need to be cautious with our use of the sources. Aegina, the island just outside of the harbor of Athens, was the first place in Greece to strike coins, probably in the last quarter of the 7th century BC. Athens used that currency, the Aeginetan currency, and it still was using it at this time. Athens did not have its own state coinage until something like 525 BC. The first state coinage was the famous owls of Athens, which had on one side the head of Athena, and on the other side her owl, kind of like a totem animal. They didn't come about until much later, though, is the point, after Solon, right? Solon is an extraordinary archon in the 590s, so the first coins in Athens didn't start coming about until the 520s. So what has happened here is that the Athenian constitution is anachronistic. It has gotten something wrong. It has ascribed to Solon something that comes about much later, and it's a nice example of what I've been talking about throughout our time together, at least definitely in this lecture, the legendary versus the historical Solon. But Solon does seem to have changed Attica's system of weights and measures. We don't need to go into the details of it, but he did make it more uniform than those that had been used elsewhere in Greece. And this, of course, would have helped with trade and by extension, the economy. Because, of course, if you're trading things, having the exact amount of something for a price is very important. And so you can see how one law feeds into the economic side of things. And in fact, Solon's economic legislation sounds really good, doesn't it? It sounds wonderful, in fact. But how far did it cure as opposed to relieve the situation? Is it something like taking an Advil when you have a cold? It does seem to relieve the symptoms, but it doesn't actually cure you. Well, in theory, under Solon's legislation, the ordinary man was better off, but in practice, far from it. Solon might have canceled all debts and might have given the farmers their lands back, and yes, that is a good thing. He made them, again, unencumbered occupants of their own land. But they would continue to be under pressure because of what they were trying to grow. What they were trying to grow, after all, was wheat, was grain, and it wasn't going to grow on Attic soil in any real preponderance. And those problems were only going to be compounded by natural disasters, poor soil, and all the problems that we've talked about already. So they're going to face the same problems again as they did before Solon. Infertile soil doesn't become fertile again just because the person working the land has gotten his farm back. And that means that the farmers would once again be forced to turn to their aristocratic neighbors for help to get them through to the next harvest. They would again find themselves in debt, again They would find themselves reduced to the status of hectemeroi. They would probably lose their lands again. But this time, they have nothing else to put up as collateral, because remember, Solon had banned putting up one's actual body as collateral on any future loan. And so this meant that their neighbors might be indeed less inclined to help them. It might mean that farmers, therefore, have an even bigger problem on their hands, because now they can't even sell themselves off as slaves. Maybe they would just simply flee from Greece, as they had done before, rather than have their families seized in some way or suffer starvation. We cannot blame Solon, therefore, for this problem, because the farmers thwarted his plan to make their overworked plots economically viable by changing to olives. They refused, it seems, to do this. Why they resisted him is not entirely known. One reason, though, might be because he didn't give them their land redistribution, and they might have thought, well, he didn't give us what we want, so we're not going to do what he says. Let's forget about the cancellation of debts and getting our farms back. That is a possibility. Another reason, and this is the one that I sort of lean towards, is simple human nature. Even today, of course, when we are faced with change, the first thing we ask, or at least the first thing I ask, is what's in it for me? And the second question is, of course, is how much do I have to work to get that? How much do I have to do? Olive trees, I am told by people who actually grow things, take a long time to mature, half a generation or so, as I am told. And the farmers probably didn't want to take on anything that was A, new to them, and B, going to cost them a lot of time and effort. After all, they had no idea what sort of return on investment they were going to make. We, looking back on this period with hindsight, of course, say, didn't these people have a clue? It's like buying shares of Amazon in the late 90s, right? You could have had such a huge ROI, but at the time, you just don't know whether you should invest in it or not. And for those of you that have invested in Bitcoin, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. In the short term, the non-nobles were worse off, and they came to resent Solon because they thought he hadn't done enough. Their situations would change in the long term, of course, and no one could foresee that at the time. Indeed, an offshoot of Solon's legislation was actually to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, just to import a totally anachronistic Marxist term there, because of the increase in wealth, right? With the increased use of currency, there was less of a need, and eventually no need at all, to barter. The Greeks had used a barter system for most of their history down to the Archaic period, but as well as not being economically beneficial, bartering was also very cumbersome, right? If you want to exchange something for 2 sheep, you then have to carry around 2 sheep, and money was much easier to carry. And so, but it was easier for people who had it, not so for the small farmers who did not have it. So all of a sudden, there is actually a widening of this division between the haves and the have-nots. Solon may not have foreseen that. And I think he probably did not. But nevertheless, it was something that I think we can justifiably say was a consequence of his economic and social legislation. And the same short-term versus long-term benefit also applies to the city itself of Athens. In the short term, there was no huge production of pottery in the short term. It did begin with Solon, but it was not a meteoric start of pottery production, and it would become very much more productive later on. But at this time, it was just kind of a shift in the economy, an increase, but only on the initial level. And as a result, everyone began. People began to get more money. Those that did benefit from trade, and those did benefit from this new importation of goods. But that was not everybody. Okay, potters moving to Athens did do better, and those who were connected with them, but not everyone felt that. The potters moving to Athens soon did spur others to do the same, and over time, half a century later, under the rule of the tyrant Pisistratus, Athenian potters and artists began to experiment with new artistic styles and to produce ornamental ware. As we saw in our opening lecture, we talked a little bit about that. and Athens would become the leading producer of ornamental ware in the Greek world. Its pottery would play a very significant role in its economy, as would its olive oil, and that would all come about as a consequence of Solon's legislation. But again, it only really begins here in its initial phase, and so the immediate benefit of those changes was not felt immediately. Solon made far more radical changes in the political and judicial spheres. So if you think the economic and social measures that he introduced are fairly radical, as they are, the Sisakthea, the cancelling of debts, giving farmers back their land again, if you think all of that is radical, well, the flip side of this is that the aristocrats lost out big time. They weren't going to get their debts repaid, and they weren't going to get what they had lent the poor farmers back. And they had lost their largish estates that they were building up because they were seizing other people's lands. And that's all quite radical. And no wonder that he upset both sides of society. But as I said, if you think that that is radical and revolutionary, just wait a moment until you see what he did in the political and judicial spheres, because those are even more radical and revolutionary. And it is to those now that I want to turn, and I want to show you why he is called the father of democracy. If the hoplites were putting pressure on the aristocrats, the Eupatridae, for some say in political affairs and some access to the higher offices of state, then Solon was prepared to respond to their pleas. We know this because he attacked the very heart of Eupatridae rule. He replaced birth by wealth as the prerequisite for political office. Now, that doesn't sound very good, does it? Both of those things sound bad to an American's ears, I suppose, but it actually is an improvement. In other words, if you worked hard enough and you acquired the necessary wealth, you could indeed stand for one of the archonships, and it did not matter anymore whether you were born noble or non-noble, right? That you cannot change your birth. You can change your wealth status. Therefore, gone was the closed shop of political offices that had been open only to the Eupatridae. And now it was open to anyone who had the means, the money for it. And that could be acquired, again, through these new mercantile avenues that had been opened up by Solon's economic legislation. And this measure effectively ended the Eupatridae monopoly of political power because it allowed non-nobles eventually to stand for political office. To work out how much wealth a person needed to take part in political life, Solon divided the Athenians into 4 economic groups. And I'm going to warn you now, a lot of strange ancient Greek names are about to be thrown at you. Okay, so there are these 4 different economic groups that each person in society would be kind of put into, depending on how much wealth they had. These groups, are you ready, were the Pentecostiomedimnoi, the Hippes, the Zugatai, and the Thiets, or simply anglicized the Thiets. Now, that is quite a mouthful, I know, so I'll just repeat them. The Pentecostiomedimnoi, the Hippes, the Zugatai, and the Thiets. Membership of each of these groups was by an assessment of wealth, and this was measured by the amount of annual produce from one's lands. In other words, whether it was bushels of wheat or measures of oil. These were the 2 different kind of measures that would be taken into account to see what category you fell into. So to be a member of the top group, that is the Pentecostiomedimnoi, your land had to produce more than 500 bushels or medimnoi. So Pentecostia, this of course would mean 500, and the medimnoi part are the bushels, bushels of wheat or measures of oil. And or some combination of both per year. Okay, so if you had 500 of those, then or more, then you were part of the top economic group, the 500 measure group. Now, people who know far more about these things than I do have been able to calculate that this particular group, in order to be able to grow at least 500 measures of either wheat or olive oil, they had to have farms that were around 110 acres or so. So it gives you some idea of how much land we're talking about here. Just note, by the way, how that is not really a big number compared to, say, American farms, right? That can get to be thousands and thousands of acres. I'm just going to put that out there. It shows you really the small scale of city-state life that we're really talking about here. That a person of the highest economic status would have an area that is large. Of course, 110. I mean, I live in an apartment, for goodness sake. But the idea of having 1 acre of land is so far out of my imagination I can't even think about it. But nevertheless, it's 110 acres is not so large that it's stupendously enormous. Anyway, to be a member of the second group, the Hippes group, the second one down, your land had to produce more than 300 bushels, but no less. I'm sorry, but less than 500. So somewhere between 300 and 500 bushels of either wheat, oil, or a combination of the two. The Hippes class were still aristocrats, and you can tell that because their name, Hippes, comes from the Greek word for horse, hippos. We can hear this word both in the aristocratic name Philippos, Philip, the lover of the horse, the friend of the horse, aristocratic because only people who grew up riding horses, then as now, you had to be quite wealthy to do that. And also we hear it in the word hippopotamus, which literally means a river horse, a hippos of the potamos. But what it meant here, though, was that a person of the Hippes class was wealthy enough that they could afford to bring a horse with them into battle. That is, when they went off into the army, they were part of the cavalry. This is, if you've studied Roman history, you'll know this is exactly like the Ordo Equester, the equestrian order, okay, which are kind of like second-rung aristocrats. To be a member of the third group, that is the Zugatai, one's land had to produce more than 200 bushels, but again, less than the 300. It is hard to translate the word Zugatai in the Penguin classical translation of the Athenian Constitution, which is actually quite a good translation. The word that they translate there for Zugatai is rancor, R-A-N-K-E-R. But this always has puzzled me. I'm not quite sure what a rancor is, and certainly students of mine have had a lot of problems coming to grips with that term. Certainly, we know etymologically what the word means. It comes from the word for yoke, as in Y-O-K-E. That is the harness for 2 oxen that one would use to plow a field. So somebody who was rich enough, obviously, to own a couple of oxen to plow one's land, that would be where that comes from. And so what we can say about them with this third group, the Zugatai, is that this would have included the hoplites, okay? In other words, these were the men who were wealthy enough to afford their own arms and armor in the infantry, but not quite wealthy enough to afford horses so as to take part in the cavalry. So they're not aristocrats, but they are that middle stratum of society that I've been talking about, the hoplite class. Finally, the lowest group were the Thetes or the Thiets. These were simply men whose land produced less than 200 bushels. The term Thiets is literally translated as laborers, those who place things, literally, must be where that comes from. Those people who kind of are, who pick things up and put them down again, basically. They were the plebeians, in other words, if you want to translate that over into Roman terms. And so it is not a surprise, given the period that we're dealing with, to see that wealth is still very much measured by land, not by money. And if we were to come up with something like a modern analogy for this, we might say that, well, first of all, we might say, well, what is the point of doing all this? It's so great to arrange people into artificial groupings based upon their wealth, but what and that may only have gone to serve to highlight the differences between the haves and the have-nots, kind of like, and this is the modern analogy, kind of like when you go to the airport and the vast majority of us are standing there in the coach line, which is long and slow, and then you see some very wealthy people kind of strutting by you, going right on up to business, and you don't even see the first class people, right? Because you have to walk through the plane to get to see like the cushioned couches and whatever beds that they have. It's kind of like that. Okay, these different classes that are available in society. But again, the question is, so what? So what? What does this do? These artificial groupings? Well, the answer to that is where the political element comes in, because these groups didn't just have this economic function of working out who was wealthy and who was not. Solon used these groups to divide all offices of state among them, to stand for the top 3 archons, that is the archon Basileus, the archon Polemarchus, and the archon Eponymous. Candidates had to come from the top 2 classes, that is from the Pentacosio Medimnoi and the Hippes. If you wanted to stand for the thesmathetai, remember there were 6 of those every year, then the third class, the Zugatai, or the hoplite class, I won't use the word rankers, were eligible for that particular office. That left the lowest class, the Thiets, and I'm sorry to say they were ineligible to stand for any political office. They didn't get anything in terms of political rights. So we have a situation then wherein the wealthy, that is the aristocrats, were eligible for the archonship, and they would become members of the Areopagus at the end of their archonship. They were still in charge of state administration. It looks as though, you might say, nothing has changed. But yes, indeed, there has been a big change. There has been a revolutionary change, a fundamental change, because now in time, non-nobles, if they worked hard enough, could acquire the necessary wealth to get themselves into those top 2 groups and stand for the archonship. And again, if we were to go back to my airport analogy, we might, as us poor plebs are standing there online for the coach thing, sweating and feeling very unhappy, but we look at those rich people going by to business class, we might say to ourselves, one day I'm going to be like that. I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to, invest in things and save my money so that one day I can go and fly on business class or even first class. Well, the losers in all of this are the Thiets. They could not stand for any political office. But even here, they were not neglected. They weren't actually losers in reality, because Solon now enacted that the assembly was to meet, the assembly, remember, the Ecclesia, was to meet more regularly, and that all citizens, including the Thiets, could attend it. Before this time, the Ecclesia, the assembly, met only at the whim of the Eupatridai. We've talked about this before. It either met occasionally or perhaps not at all. Now it was to meet regularly, and it was going to debate and vote on all matters, both foreign and domestic, and it was open to all citizens. And by citizens, of course, yes, we do mean males, and only males over the age of 18. All women, although they were technically citizens and had citizenship rights in terms of legal matters, they did not have the franchise. In other words, they were not allowed to vote or to take part in any political deliberations. In fact, they couldn't even represent themselves in the legal system, something we'll come back to later on. So when we talk about citizens, as far as Athens is concerned here, we're talking about males over the age of 18. Since all matters of foreign and domestic policy now came before the Ecclesia, the assembly, and these things were debated and then voted upon to become policy, and now, because the Thiets were allowed into the Ecclesia, the assembly, this gave the Thiets a lot of power, even more power, in fact, because Solon now made the assembly the organ that elected the archons. And this is the icing on the cake. The Ecclesia, the assembly, was now to conduct an inquiry into the archon's term of office when it came to an end. And this inquiry was known as the euthune. The word literally means straightening out, straightening it well. But we might translate it as scrutiny or inquiry. In other words, so at the end of the year in office, the Ecclesia would deliberate upon, they would look into all the matters that had been taking place by that archon. Everything that archon did was subject to scrutiny. If he had discharged his duties properly, if he hadn't been corrupt, if he had done a decent job, then he could be allowed into the Areopagus. But if he was found to have been corrupt, if he had messed up in office, or even worse, had been found to have been taking bribes, then he would not be allowed to enter into the Areopagus. And remember how powerful the Areopagus was. All archons wanted to be in it. And now the decision as to whether or not they were allowed into it lay with the people, the assembly, the Ecclesia. And numerically, they were always going to be much more numerous than the nobles were. That is, the non-nobles would always be much more numerous than the nobles. So this really gave the people a lot of power. So even in this, we have a real change occurring. We have an assembly now then that has gone from meeting never or perhaps only occasionally before Solon to one that now meets regularly. The people as a whole now have a say in how affairs of state should run. And this is totally different from the time before Solon. The Eupatridai monopoly of power has ended. And this is so important Look at how it ended. It ended peacefully. There was no civil strife. There was no form of bloody unrest that led to the overthrow of an existing regime, as happened in some of the states we've talked about, some of the Peloponnesian tyrannies, and certainly has been the case throughout history. But on top of it, Solon did one more thing to help change the political landscape in a very radical way. Solon was responsible for creating a new council of 400 men. This council came to be called the Boule. It was made up of 400, 100 men from each of the 4 tribes that the Athenians were divided into. And I'll just remind you that when we say Athenians here, we are talking about the entire Attic population. Remember that when Athens became the polis of Attica, all of those living throughout Attica became Athenian citizens. So everybody living here in this pink section that you see down here, that is the entire Attica peninsula. So the Boule, this council of 400, now is added to the Athenian Constitution. We therefore have 4 organs now that make up the Athenian state. There were only 3 before, now there are 4. Membership of this Boule was open only to the top 3 groups, that is the Pentacostion Medimnoi, the Hippes, and the Zugatai. And if you could remember the names of those, you're doing very well. Those are hard things to remember. But let's just remind ourselves, again, who is excluded? The Thiets, once again. But as I said, this is not necessarily in their disfavor when we look at what was the method to Solon's apparent badness. Why did Solon introduce the Boule, and what did it actually do? Well, Solon intended the Ecclesia, the assembly, to meet more regularly, as I've said. And it was to discuss and it was to vote on all matters of state. But Solon knew that the majority of attendees had no political experience. How could they have? They had lived under this narrow oligarchy of Eupatridae rule their entire lives. The assembly, the Ecclesia, had never been called, or if it was only very occasionally. We have a situation, therefore, wherein all of a sudden people with zero political experience find themselves suddenly making decisions. And moreover, let's not forget the Areopagus, composed of ex-archons, aristocrats, Eupatridae, oligarchic, all to a man in ideology. That might all of those men in the Areopagus, they might try to remove the power of the assembly. And so for the assembly to function more efficiently, to function even really basically at all, it needed an executive arm to administer it and to guide it. And that is where the Boule comes into play. The Boule prepared the agenda for the Ecclesia, the assembly, and it also had this is a wonderful scholarly term that gets created out of Greek, a probouleotic function. What that means is probouletic is that the idea that members of the Boule deliberated on each agenda item beforehand. That's what the pro here means. And before the assembly met, and then when they brought the agenda to the assembly, they reported their conclusions on those agenda items to the people and gave recommendations. In other words, the probouleomata, this is the Greek word, were like their resolutions, their bits of, the acta senatus or something like that. Or no, I'm sorry, that is not the term in Latin. It would be the senatus consulta. That would be the Latin word. It would be kind of the analogy for that in Roman history. The acta senatus is kind of like a newspaper, actually. The assembly could go along with the Boule's recommendation on a particular item, or it could reject it. It had the power to do either. They didn't have to simply follow everything that the Boule suggested. Solon evidently did not trust the Areopagus to do its job fairly. And here we can see something that's so wise and something that our own founding fathers put into the framing of our own constitution, the idea that there is always going to be arrogation of power, greed, trying to take for oneself more than one's fair share of political power. And there must be built into a constitution checks and balances, because anything else, any other, if it's just pie in the sky, it's not going to work. So that's why he created this new council. And I think he was right to do this. I think he was absolutely right to suspect the Areopagus, because I have no hesitation in saying that the Areopagus, given their oligarchical background and disposition point of view, would have tried to ride roughshod over the wishes of the Ecclesia, the assembly, because after all, given its constitution, it would have wanted a return to pre-Solonian times, a return to how it used to exercise political power in tandem with the archons. It was against popular power. And therefore, in time, what we have is a situation wherein the Boule would play a very important role in the constitution, because it met more regularly than the Ecclesia, the assembly. It met practically every day as time goes on. And it would deal with business a lot faster. We might say that we don't really have a democracy then in our sense, do we? Because not every citizen could stand for office. Women certainly weren't allowed to vote. I don't want to get bogged down in that, though, in that question, because that's the sort of question that really is the product of our own modern upbringing, our own Western tradition, wherein we have 2,500 years plus to look back at the Athenian Society and judge it from our own vantage point. The Athenian Society must be judged in its own terms. As George Bernard Shaw one time put it so well, every man, and we can say every society, needs to be judged by a jury of its own time. Certainly, this is a huge revolutionary change in terms of bringing power to the people under the legislation of Solon. We can say, of course, that the Thiets do seem to be disadvantaged because they could not stand for the archonship. They couldn't stand for the Boule. Moreover, only the aristocrats were wealthy enough to live and work in Athens for that 1 year as members of the Boule. There was no pay at this time for being a member of the Boule, so that meant that ordinary people could not just simply, take a year off to move to Athens to live and work there and be part of the Boule. So those are definitely negatives in terms of the fully democratic qualities of Athens. But what is the difference then? We might push back and say, what is the difference between aristocrats in the Boule influencing the people by means of their resolutions, and the old system of the Areopagus and archons ruling in tandem? They were the ones who decided what was what back then. Isn't the Boule just deciding what's what now? Well, the answer is we are in a very different Athens. To begin with, the Thiets were disadvantaged because they could not stand for the archonship. They could not become members of the Boule. But Solon, as I say, was right to restrict them like that. He knew that the aristocrats had the experience in governing. It doesn't matter if they did a good job or a bad job, and as we've seen, basically, they did do a bad job. But the bottom line was that they did have experience. They knew the levers of power, and the ordinary people did not. If one were to elevate the Thiets at this time, all of a sudden, to political office, that would have had enormously adverse consequences for the state, because they didn't have experience running it. And just think about it. If you yourselves were all of a sudden thrust into a situation in which you had no prior experience, if you took over a company or something like that, if you suddenly found yourself doing a job that you have never done before, you're going to flounder. Okay, you're going to need help, and for that, you're going to need to be guided until you come into your own. And that was basically what was behind Solon's idea of keeping the Thiets out of political power, but giving them the right to attend the assembly, the Ecclesia. An Ecclesia, an assembly that's guided by the Boule, but one which can still reject the Boule's recommendation, is going to be much more successful, and indeed is the largest democratic step that could have been taken at that time. In time, through their attendance at the assembly, through debate, through listening, through voting, kind of getting the hang of it, they would gain experience. And if they chose to work their way up, if they had the gumption, they could make it up theoretically into those top two groups of the Pentacosium Medimnoi and the Hippes. They could stand for the archonship then, and this becomes an incentive, a meritocratic incentive to make people work harder, because it would have the byproduct of benefiting them, the direct consequence, I should say, of benefiting them. And of course, all that hard work and industry would have the byproduct of benefiting the city's economy. So there's that. As for what's the difference between aristocrats and the Boule influencing the people and the old system of the Areopagus and archons deciding what was what, we must remember that the assembly is now a check on those wanting to become archons. And it's also the organ that from now on decides whether an ex-archon is going to become a member of the Areopagus. The ordinary people, therefore, have suddenly gotten a lot of power over candidates for the archonship. And then, because the assembly decides the euthune, that scrutiny over an archon's year in office and whether or not they get to be put into the Areopagus, it has a lot of power over ex-archons entering the Areopagus. Just imagine if we could do that. If we could take a look at each president or senator or House of Representatives member and scrutinize every one of their actions and all of their insider trading and all of their all the money they've taken from lobbyists and stuff like that, and say, no, you're getting out of here, no more for you. Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? These facts all make immediately obvious the fact that the old system of archons and Areopagus is now defunct. Okay, that we are now in a much better situation, a much more democratic situation. And I do imagine that the Boule often threw its weight around. I imagine it wanted to lead the assembly, and of course, it did. All of the members of the Boule in this time would have been aristocrats. But the fact that the assembly didn't need to follow its recommendations, and that once the assembly voted on something, whether yes or no, in favor or against a proposal, that decision could not be overturned. It was now law. This is a very far cry from the days before Solon, when the Eupatridae ruled as a matter of course, and the people had no political rights, no say whatsoever in political life. We can see then why Solon has been named the father of democracy, because he opened up political office and political participation to non-nobles. He didn't introduce a fully developed system, of course, nobody does. But what he did do was get the whole process started. And to put that in biological terms, he fathered it. I mentioned that Solon had also introduced new legal rights. And at this point, I would like to now turn to Solon's judicial reforms. Here, Solon amended many of the laws of Dracon as far as punishment went. But more importantly for us today, he introduced the right of appeal against a magistrate's decision. This was through a procedure that in Greek is known as ephesis, and in tandem with this, he introduced this court of appeal that is known as the Helia. Moreover, he introduced what I will call third-party intervention, and I'd like to take a look at all of these things. The Helia, the court of appeal, as it is usually translated, was probably not an actual court where one could say, look, here's the Helia, I've put in front of you a place where certain assembly meetings took place. And that is probably what happened. It was probably the assembly that sat in some quasi-judicial capacity. We don't know exactly what it did, but most likely there was a point in the assembly's meeting where it examined a case. It may not have actually looked at the penalty that had been handed down and that somebody was appealing against, but more likely, this is the common opinion of scholars, is that it examined a case afresh from the beginning. The beauty of the Helia, though we don't know exactly what it did, is that it gave non-nobles a much greater say in the dispensation of justice. And also, there was now the right to appeal. Again, neither of these two things existed before Solon. And I would argue, and indeed I'm going to argue when we get to the later law lecture, that the Helia was the ancestor of the people's court, of the fully developed democracy. That our courts today harken back to the Helia is going to be basically what I'm getting at. Not everybody would agree with that, and we'll talk about this surprisingly controversial topic, as I said, when we get to the lecture on law and society much later in our course. As for third-party intervention, this is where Solon made it possible for any citizen to prosecute someone on behalf of another. Now, today we take this right for granted, just like we take the right of appeal for granted. It's part of our culture, Western civilization. Every Western democracy has these things in it. We're used to it. But before Solon, only the injured party, that is, only the victim or the victim's family, had the right to initiate proceedings. Now, of course, anybody could, on behalf of another person, after Solon's legislation. And that's really, really important when you think about how a victim might be intimidated in some way to take action against a person who might have been beaten up, might have had his sheep stolen or something like that. Now somebody else could come in on his side, and that person could kind of, stay back. Solon also introduced various other laws, and I've mentioned this before. That law that children had to look after their parents in old age, and that parents had to have their sons taught a trade. He was also said to have laid down laws about general behavior in public, which appear to us as kind of strange. Some of them seem normal, I guess, laws about wills and inheritance matters, but they had also kind of more religiously inflected ones, like laws prohibiting speaking ill of the dead, and apparently a whole host of regulations affecting women. These included what they should wear in public. For instance, that they weren't allowed to wear more than 3 cloaks. And certainly a funny one by our standards was a law that Solon apparently introduced that stated that women were not allowed to attend the funerals of anyone but their own relatives until they hit the age of 60. That one strikes us as very odd. Imagine, a lady on the day of her 60th birthday blowing out the candles of her birthday cake and saying, "Come on, girls, let's go to some funerals." But this law was meant to regulate the number of times a woman was seen in public, and as strange as this may seem, to prevent her being chatted up by a would-be adulterer and coaxed into having an affair, even at a funeral. And believe it or not, we know that this happened at least once, and apparently, judging from this law, more than, it was something that was maybe somewhat a known quantity, a known entity, because we actually have a legal speech that was given in the 4th century in Athens, given by a man who came home and found his wife in flagrante delicto and killed the adulterer. And when he gives, this is his speech in defense of himself, and he mentions the fact that his wife met this man at a funeral. Okay. Again, so women in general in Athens were really kept under lock and key to a large degree. They were not allowed out very much, and so some of the only places where they would go out to would be funerals. And so that apparently was enough of a chance that Solons didn't want to take it. And basically, this, if you're thinking that all this sounds very strange, and it does, we have to point out the fact that the Athenians, as we will talk about later on, were essentially obsessed with the legitimacy of their children. And in fact, the entire body of Greek law will ultimately grow out of this, out of issues surrounding the domestic sphere. They were primarily obsessed with the legitimacy of their children because only legitimate children could inherit what in Greek was known as the oikos, or the household estate. Today, of course, legitimacy is not as much of a preoccupation. Of course, on an emotional level, no doubt it is, but we do have things like DNA tests. But back then, of course, there was no DNA test. And if a wife had an affair, even after children had been born, then that threw the legitimacy of all of their children suddenly into question. And that means that maybe, because only children of Athenian parents could become citizens. So now the citizenship of those children has been thrown into question. Certainly the inheritance could be endangered. And that is why adultery was treated as a public offense in Athens. And as I say, we have this fascinating defense speech from an adultery case in the 4th century, in which a man's wife was picked up by another man at a funeral. In that case, it was the funeral of her mother-in-law. So this obviously happened. And all of these laws affected citizen women, of course. And as a result, women tended to become segregated in society. They weren't totally secluded. I don't want to give you the wrong idea. We're not dealing with a kind of Taliban-like society here. Anyone who does say that women were totally secluded in ancient Athens would be wrong. But they did tend to be segregated in society. There tended to be kind of limits put on how much they got out and about and what sort of gatherings they could attend. And incidentally, small point, but interesting, Solon seems to be totally uninterested, totally unbothered by non-citizen women. These could be foreign wives, foreign resident aliens, prostitutes, courtesans. In fact, one of the most famous politicians of all of ancient Greece. Pericles, his main squeeze was a foreign woman named Aspasia, who was a foreign courtesan. Solon doesn't seem to be worried at all about these, because it was really all about citizenship rights and inheritance rights and all of that kind of stuff. So that's why his rules and regulations were only for citizen women. There's a problem, though, with Solon's many laws, and that is that they may not all have been introduced by him, but rather some of them may have been brought in at a later period and then ascribed to him to give them a sort of pedigree, as if one were to say, oh, this is one of Solon's laws, therefore it must be good. We have to follow it, because after all, he's the father of democracy. He's one of the seven sages. We have to be careful, therefore, when we read in later sources that attribute such and such law to Solon. I mentioned this before. It is sometimes difficult to separate the historical Solon from the legendary. And it is interesting, at least to me, but I think it is interesting in general, that the Athenian Constitution, the document that we've talked about so much, tells us that the three most democratic elements of the Solonian Constitution were the following. First, the prohibition of loans secured upon an actual person, no debt bondage. Secondly, the ability for anyone to prosecute on behalf of another citizen, what I have just called third-party intervention. And third, the right of appeal. So the prohibition of loans secured upon an actual person, the ability of anyone to prosecute on behalf of another, and the right of appeal. We can certainly agree with all of these, even especially the first one. Although, as we've said, the prohibition of loans secured on the actual person did cause smaller farmers some hardship in the immediate short term, because they could not put themselves up for loans, and therefore their families for collateral, and then rich aristocrats might not have been prepared to help them out. But it does seem startling to me, I think, that in talking about these three most democratic elements, the document, the Athenian Constitution, does not mention anything about non-nobles now having political power in the assembly. And it doesn't say anything about non-nobles and how they can stand for political office. Why doesn't it say this? I think the answer is easy. We don't know. But here's my theory. No, I'm serious. The answer, I think, must be that because the Athenian Constitution describes the constitution of a later legislator called Cleisthenes, and we'll meet him in time. And he is the one who reformed everything in 508 BC. And it refers to that later constitution of Cleisthenes in 508 as, quote, more democratic than that of Solon, end quote. And so, in other words, if the Athenian Constitution has the view that it does, namely that it explicitly does not refer to opening the door to political office for non-nobles, which we know happened under Solon, then it did this because that might in some ways take away from the democratic developments under Cleisthenes, when Cleisthenes took democracy to the masses, and they want to kind of make it seem that Solon did not. I think that's why the Athenian Constitution has the view that it does. Solon expected the Areopagus and the archons to continue running affairs as before, and for the people to have a say in those affairs via the assembly. But Solon's constitution only favored those who were able to attend the assembly meetings, and those people had to be in person in Athens. People who lived in rural areas of Attica could not take the time off to travel, to walk in. Remember, it would have taken time in itself, even to attend the assembly, and then walk all the way back to their farms. And just think about elections today, all right? Even things that are, it's very easy in many ways to vote nowadays, and yet even so, to take time off from work and the other kind of things that have to, standing on line sometimes, that can be enough to put people off from voting. The amount of people that actually vote in elections is pitifully small in America, and so my only point is that it would have been definitely there would have been a lot of reasons for common people who lived outside of Athens not to have taken part in the democratic processes, even though it was open to them. Cleisthenes, though, we will see, gave people outside of Athens, throughout Attica, the chance to take part in the political system. He brought in mass democracy, we might say. And the writer of the Athenian Constitution doesn't count Solon's political innovations among the most democratic elements of his constitution because he thinks essentially that Cleisthenes did better. Now, there's no question that Solon was a vastly influential figure in the development of the Greek democratic and legal systems, and they are the ancestors of both of these that we live by today. But despite what he did, both sides of society were displeased with him, and now we are going to ask a number of questions that relate to this. Why were both sides dissatisfied with him? Why were they justified, or we might say, were they justified to feel this way? And if they were, then can we really call Solon's legislation successful? The people of Athens were still far from having any common political outlook, and thus they were also dissatisfied, unhappy with what Solon had done. Why did they feel this way? And were they justified to do so? We'll consider these questions, and by extension, the question of whether we should call Solon's legislation successful. And then I would like to consider the aftermath of his legislation, because despite what he did, Athens was headed for a tyranny. And then we will end the lecture tonight with a consideration of the Pisistrated tyranny. Solon's constitution was utopian because he assigned people into these four property groups based on where he thought their places should be in society. There was no poll, there was no questionnaire. People were put where he thought they should go. And a sign of this dissatisfaction that the people had with this is perhaps the resistance to his wanting the farmers to switch to olive cultivation on a much larger scale. Generally speaking, though, the poor thought he hadn't gone far enough because he didn't redistribute the land. The Hoplites, that would be the members of the Zugatai group, would also have been dissatisfied because he had opened up to them only the relatively minor political office of the Thesmothetai, not the archonships, which, as we remember, only the two top groups were eligible for. So the Hoplites were still denied a share in real power, that is, the archonships. And the aristocrats, for their part, thought Solon had gone too far with things like the cancellation of debts, the Sisakthea, the abolition of birth and the replacement of it with wealth as the prerequisite for political office, and of course the holding of regular meetings of the assembly, the Ecclesia, attended by all citizens, and which also monitored the activities of the archons in the form of the Othune. Perhaps then it is not a surprise that Solon did upset all sides of society because it was a real, genuine compromise. Both sides, rich and poor, noble and non-noble, were all displeased with what he had done. But as I've said before, Solon was not interested in winning popularity contests and making friends. He chose rather to suffer the wrath of both sides because he wanted to act only in the city's best interests. But at the same time, he did let fly at the people for the way they criticized him, as he tells us in his poetry when he writes, for instance, "Now they are angry with me. Everyone looks at me with suspicion as if I were their enemy. It should not be like this. What I said, I did with the gods' help." And again, what the people have now, their eyes would have never seen, even in their dreams. Those whose lives are more powerful and more lucky should praise me and make me their friend. As with Dracon's laws, Solon's were inscribed on courbes and axones, those wooden blocks with four sides with writing on each side, and they were set up on poles in the portico of the office of the Archon Basileus in the Agora, that is the marketplace. We are told that this is where the 9 archons took their oath when coming into office, that is the 3 main archons and the 6 thesmothetai. And they also, that is where, and they also promised to dedicate a gold statue at Delphi if they transgressed any of Solon's laws. This was a practice that actually continued into the 320s BC because the document, the Athenian Constitution, says that the archons were still doing it in its own time. In the 320s, the Athenian Constitution also tells us that Solon made his laws complicated and ambiguous in their wording on purpose, so that the Athenians were often in dispute over them. We have to take the Athenian Constitution's word at this because we don't actually have anything that we can definitively hold up and say this is one of Solon's original laws. Look at how opaque its wording is. We don't have anything like that. So we have to rely on these later sources that tell us this sort of information. But if they are right, and they very well might be, that raises an interesting question. Why on earth would Solon make his laws deliberately hard to understand? Did he slip up? Or did he overestimate the intelligence of the people? And of course, I think the answer is no. He did not. He didn't overestimate their intelligence. Everything that Solon did was for a reason. He clearly was a very intelligent person. Making his laws hard to understand and their wording was deliberate, and it was a good thing too, because it meant that people would now have to learn to interpret them rather than to blindly follow black and white guidelines. However, it does seem that people were constantly pestering Solon about this law or that law. They were belly aching really about them to him. They were wanting him to tell them what such and such a law meant, and therefore they were trying to get him to tell them what they needed to do. And so he decided that his presence in Athens was actually having the opposite effect to what he wanted, which was, after all, to make people think. And with this in mind, he left Athens and went to Egypt. The Athenian Constitution says that he went there, quote, to engage in trade and to see the sights, end quote. So he went on a vacation, basically, and he vowed not to return to Athens for 10 years. And so it is at this point that we will end our discussion of what Solon did and see him off sailing down the Nile, off into the sunset. But we will certainly not end our discussion here at this point, because I want to turn to that other question. That is, if the people were dissatisfied with him, as they seem to have been, and he recognizes that they were, then should we be able to ask the question, how successful was he? That is this a legitimate question to ask of someone who had introduced all of this political, social, economic, and judicial legislation? It's an odd question, but it is an important one, and it is part of the fun, really, of history to ask these sorts of things. There's no doubt that if you just learn the assemblage of facts and don't kind of mentally try to get into the the interpretive side of things, then it's not really as interesting as history can be. And so, to that end, let us begin by saying that there is no doubt that Solon's legislation had far reaching consequences as far as those political, economic, and judicial areas went. And we can recognize his importance in history. But was he successful? Well, usually the immediate answer is yes, because people think of what he did. After all, he is the father of democracy. How could he have done anything wrong? But technically, I think the correct answer, ought to be no. Solon was not successful, because after he left Athens, after he went to Egypt, the grievances of both sides, that is, the noble and non-noble alike, soon exploded again, and civil strife broke out yet once more. And it wouldn't be long before we have a couple of periods of anarchy, that is, literal anarchia, that is, without an archon, and then a tyranny in Athens, which would last for almost 40 years. Takes us all the way to the end of the 6th century. And we'll come to that in a moment. So, stepping back then, we must remember Solon had been made extraordinary archon by the Eupatridae to end the civil war. But he did not end the civil war because he left Athens, and immediately afterwards, civil strife broke out again. And eventually, we have full-out warfare. So technically, he was unsuccessful in that. We can even argue that Solon steered Athens down the path to tyranny because, thanks to him, there was even more of a struggle now for the archonship. Previously, only the Eupatridae had held this office, as we know, but now aristocrats who had not been part of the Eupatridae rulers, people who were not super aristocrats, so they didn't have political office, but now they were wealthy enough to be in those top two groups. They wanted a crack at power. And there were probably some traders who were rich enough, some artisans maybe, or merchants or whatever, who were rich enough to be placed in those top two groups as well. And they all wanted to have a crack at the archonship, and the Eupatridae resisted them. So we can come up with a negative assessment of Solon if we want to. But then again, just to be totally, back and forth on this. Do his successes outweigh his failures? That would be a further question we might ask. Think about it like this. How should we measure success? And therefore, how should we evaluate Solon? I don't want to answer those questions for you. I want you to think about them, kind of like Solon himself, making his laws deliberately clear. So I will just leave it at that, but I want you to think about them. And now I will move on to the aftermath of Solon's departure and his rise to power. And the rise to power of Pisistratus, the tyrant. And what we're going to do now, and for the remainder until we get down to 545, is we're going to cover about 50 years or so until the beginning of the Pisistratid tyranny. Not long after Solon left Athens for Egypt to go on his Nile cruise, the old conflicts, as I said, that Solon had been appointed to end, reared their heads again. It seems they were centered on control of that office of eponymous archon. And that shows us again that the three archonships, the Basileus archon, the Polemarchus archon, and the eponymous archon, it was really the last one that was most important. The Athenian Constitution tells us that for about 4 years after Solon left Athens, there was a peace of sorts in Attica. His constitution was settling down a bit, but then we are told that there were no archon elections in 590 or in 586, and there weren't any archon elections because of civil strife. So no elections places us in anarchy, no archon. So the Eupatridae presumably were no longer accepting Solon's opening up of the archonship to those who were not Eupatridae, to those who were not born of the noble father. That made them part of that upper echelon of the aristocrats. And it didn't matter to them how wealthy one was. There was resistance. They were rejecting people. And obviously, that resistance was then met with opposition as well. Worse was to follow. The archon for the year 582/581, a man named Damasius, stayed in office beyond his legal year for another 14 months, until finally he was deposed by force. In other words, he tried to remain eponymous archon for 2 years and 2 months before he was finally kicked out. It is unknown whether Damasius was attempting a tyranny or whether he was a member of a Eupatridae family that was resisting all others, including these newcomers, and clinging on to that office and not wanting to give it up because of the way the Constitution had changed. We don't know. But what we can say is that as the 590s and the 580s BC wore on, conditions in Attica could not have been that different from the time before Solon. Anarchia, a possible attempted tyranny, everything that Solon had been asked to fix was happening again. So we have to factor these sorts of things into any assessment of Solon's success. We start to get a scenario then for the rise of 3 political factions in Attica that contended for power. And we see in these 3 factions the emergence on the political scene of Pisistratus, the champion of the poor. And it is Pisistratus who would establish a tyranny that lasted for most of the second half of the 6th century. Our sources indicate that at this time there was factional strife involving several noble families, and that these families were broadly divided into 3 geographical/political groups. We'll talk about these 3 groupings right now. One group was called the Men of the Plain. This was the area closest to Athens. The Men of the Plain group was led by a certain man named Lycurgus. The second group was called the Men of the Coast. This was the area that extended around Athens and southwards down to Cape Sunion on the Attic promontory, which is today called the Apolline Coast. This group was led by a man named Megacles. And finally, we have our third group, the Men Beyond the Hills, the Diakrioi in Greek, and beyond the hills refers to the area that was east of Athens, beyond Mount Hymettus, which you can see with the red dot there. This group was led by a nobleman named Pisistratus, who came from Brauron in eastern Attica, and he had won renown in a recent war with Megara, which was on Attica's western border. Like the tyrants in other states that we've talked about, Pisistratus used his reputation from this warfare to support his bid for power. So he was already a household name by the time he had tried to establish a tyranny. And these three groups, the men of the plain, the men of the coast, and the men from beyond the hills, were not just geographical ones, depending on where one's leaders' power bases lay, but there was a political nature to them as well. And this political nature arose from their geographical areas. The men of the plain represented the oldest aristocratic families. They were eager for oligarchy. They wanted to, they were keen to see the undiminished power of the Eupatridae return, essentially. These were the hardcore oligarchs. The men of the coast were also aristocratic, but because of their location, the majority of them probably engaged in trade, in mercantilism and fishing. They seem to have favored a middle or moderate type of constitution that would have been in keeping with the mass of them being hoplites, you see. And finally, the men from beyond the hills, that is a reference, as I said, to Mount Hymettus. This group favored a constitution in which the people as a whole, both noble and non-nobles, had a say in political affairs. In that part of Attica, that is in the eastern part of Attica, beyond Mount Hymettus, most of the people would have been ordinary farmers. But the Athenian Constitution tells us that this group also included a motley assortment of other people, and these included men who would become poor because of the Syzochthea, you see, and that is those who had their debts. They were the ones who held the debts that were now shaken off, and these were also, we are told, not of pure Athenian descent. In this first type, those made poor because of the Syzochthea, of course, we know about that shaking off of debts. And is interesting because it shows us that the measure of the Syzochthea evidently hurt many aristocrats. When their debts were not repaid, some of them obviously fell down mightily and ended up several rungs down on the social ladder. This hurt them economically, and therefore they attached themselves to Pisistratus's group. And this second type of that is also included within this men from beyond the hills. These were the non-pure Athenian citizens. This shows us that some non-citizens evidently aspired to citizenship because they would never get it under the existing regime, and so Pisistratus was their only hope. They hitched their wagon to his star. Now, although Pisistratus was a nobleman, as I've said, he seems to have set himself up as a champion of the poor. This is just like the tyrants that we've looked at in other areas, such as in Argos or Sicyon or Corinth, as we've talked about. And we can say, therefore, that Pisistratus headed a radical group that wanted a new form of rule. And interestingly enough, the Athenian Constitution even calls Pisistratus a Democrat because he had this kind of motley assortment of people. Pisistratus also wanted to end the faction fighting between the nobles, which was the cause of all the Athenians' problems. And he also wanted, of course, to establish himself as tyrant. There wasn't a lack of his own personal gain to be had here. Whether he was a conscious reformer who did champion the rights of the poor, or whether he was exploiting the civil unrest for his own political advancement, as I say, he did want to establish a tyranny for himself, and he did. We're not sure what his exact motives were. We'll discuss these aspects shortly. In short, just to kind of spoil that, there's no reason why multiple motives can't exist within the same person. It is possible to be an aristocrat and still champion the poor as your base. You can think of your own, make your political analogies with our own modern day times, and I'll let you do that. But nevertheless, it took Pisistratus 3 attempts to seize power and to hold on to it. And I'll go over each one of these rather colorful attempts right now. His first attempt was in about 560 BC. So we're about 34 years or so after Solon. And we are told the story that he actually had himself beaten up by his own guard and appeared in the Agora one day covered in bruises. And he claimed that he had been attacked by his opponents. And he asked for a bodyguard. Apparently, Solon spoke against this. He evidently saw through Pisistratus's ruse. And Solon is said to be there speaking against this in the story, but it is very hard to accept this story as historical, especially because it is hard to accept that Solon was actually present in Athens at the time and counseled the people against giving Pisistratus a bodyguard. Solon was supposed to remember to have left Athens for 10 years. So that was in 594. And even if he did return to Athens after his Egypt trip, that would be in the late 580s. So now we're already in the 560. So he would be very, very old. It's not impossible, but it is a bit of a stretch. Nevertheless, more of a reason why I question the story is because I would expect the Athenian Constitution to say something about it, to have some reference to Solon being against Pisistratus, since the Athenian Constitution talks about Solon being against tyranny. In other words, when we get to that section of the Athenian Constitution that quotes Solon's poetry and says that he could have been tyrant, but chose not to, that's where I would expect the Athenian Constitution to have a line like, and by the way, we know that Solon hated tyranny because he told the people later not to give Pisistratus a bodyguard, but they didn't listen to him. So to me, what the sources don't say is often as important as what they do say. Anyway, the people bought Pisistratus' story. We are told that a war hero from the war against Megara was attacked by opponents was unthinkable. And so Pisistratus was immediately voted an armed bodyguard. We know it was armed because it was called the Club Bearers. And with this formidable force, he seized the Acropolis, that's the citadel in Athens, and proclaimed himself tyrant. The story continues about Solon that when Pisistratus proclaimed himself tyrant, Solon went to get his armor so that he would been that is his hoplite armor, and he set up his armor in front of his house and apparently said to the people, I have done all that I can to help my country. In other words, basically he said, I told you so. I told you not to give them a bodyguard. It's a nice story, but as I say, it very well may not be historical. Well, this first attempt at tyranny failed for Pisistratus because the families of the two other groups, that is the men of the plain, headed by Lycurgus, and the men of the coast, led by Megacles, united and kicked Pisistratus out of Athens. So his first tyranny then probably only lasted a few weeks, couldn't have lasted more than a couple of months. Pisistratus, though, was a man not to give up easily. He tried a second time, probably in the year 556, so about maybe 4.5 years later. And it is surprising how he comes back to Athens, because his former enemy, Megacles, brought him back. And it looks as though Megacles, remember, he's the leader of the men from the coast, was losing out in the struggles with Lycurgus. In other words, he wasn't getting elected archon. Megacles must have thought that by bringing Pisistratus back, he could maybe help support his bid for the archonship. And he wasn't just bringing Pisistratus back as another ruler, as a possible tyrant to help Athens, a tyrant of Athens to help Megacles, I should say, but rather Megacles wanted to bring Pisistratus back as his son-in-law. You see, he offered Pisistratus the hand of his daughter in marriage, and that, of course, would bind Pisistratus and Megacles closer together, father-in-law and son-in-law. And Megacles may have even thought that he could use Pisistratus as his puppet ruler to control Athens. Well, there's no question then that if this was the case, then Megacles' ascendancy would soar over that of Lycurgus. Remember, Megacles was apparently losing out in the Archon elections, and all of this meant that Lycurgus was winning. So Lycurgus and his faction were losing, and was winning, and so Megacles was trying to bring Pisistratus back to beat out Lycurgus. The big question is how to bring Pisistratus back. Lycurgus wasn't going to let this happen without a fight, and the people also might not be taken in so easily this time. Beating up Pisistratus, therefore, was not going to work this time. The people had been fooled before. They weren't going to be fooled again. So Megacles came up with the idea of exploiting religion. In other words, trickery. And the story that I'm now going to tell you is a really nice example of the political exploitation of religion that is so much a quality, really, of Greek history at this time. There was a very tall lady named Phia, who was from the town of Paeonia. This is a town on the other side of Mount Hymettus. Herodotus, one of our ancient sources, and we'll talk much more about Herodotus in time, he gives us her height, of course, in Greek measurements, but it works out to about 5'10" So that's very tall for a Mediterranean of that time, and especially for a Mediterranean woman. And the fact that the sources say that she was so tall shows us that the women were, in fact, certainly much shorter than this. Now, the reason for this, of course, in general, the Mediterranean stock, especially in ancient times, wouldn't have been that tall. An average Greek or Roman maybe would have stood 5'2", 5'3" on a good day. The amount of protein in their diets was simply not very great. The main source of food, as we've seen all this time, has been grain, bread, olive oil, wine. These are the so-called Mediterranean triad of foodstuffs. It was really, people did not grow to be very, very tall then. And even to this day, Mediterranean stock people are always going to be a bit shorter than, say, those of Northern Europe. Well, on average, of course. Now, what did Pisistratus do with Phia? Phia was dressed up as the goddess Athena, the patron deity of Athens, and she and Pisistratus rode inside a chariot into the city, and heralds ran in front of them, proclaiming that the goddess herself was bringing back her chosen favorite, her chosen ruler. Word of this spread like wildfire, and Lycurgus could hardly compete with the patron deity of Athens, bringing back the person whom she wanted to rule her city. The people accepted this too. They accepted what was happening without question, and so Pisistratus became tyrant for a second time. Herodotus refers to the Phia episode as a, quote, simple-minded trick, end quote. But we shouldn't come down too hard on the Athenians for being naive in this regard. You have to remember that in Greek religion, if you've read Greek myth, of course, you know that gods and goddesses are constantly popping up at fountains and other places, coming down to earth and mingling with humans. And so although Herodotus calls this trick simple-minded, it's actually not what we consider when we think of what people are willing to accept. They accepted it. Certainly the prevailing view was that the gods took human form and acted in a human affair. So it was not outside of the realm of believability that Athena might have interfered in the city's affairs in this way. And Pisistratus and Megacles knew this, and so they merely exploited this religious belief. And we will see this political exploitation of religion a lot of times in our course, and not just with Athens. Well, if Megacles thought he could dominate his new son-in-law, he was mistaken. Pisistratus refused to consummate the marriage with his new wife, presumably because he had sons from a previous marriage. He didn't want his other sons, you see, to be passed over by any children from his marriage to Megacles' daughter. But he obviously miscalculated how secure he was in his power, because Megacles found out what he was doing. I guess I should say what he wasn't doing. And so he forced Pisistratus into exile again. Pisistratus would now be absent from Athens for the next 10 years. He would eventually end up living in Thrace, which is in northern Greece, close to a very rich gold and silver mines in the area of Pangaeum. And he was able to use these natural resources there to build up a huge financial reserve. And he used this newfound wealth to hire mercenaries. And that is why 10 years later, in exactly the year 545 BC, he invaded Attica at the head of a personal army, intent as he was, this time, on seizing power and holding on to it for good. Pisistratus landed at Marathon in eastern Attica at a place named Pallini, and there he defeated an army that the nobles in Athens had sent out to try to stop him from reaching the city. Pisistratus was now determined that he wasn't going to be kicked out of Athens again, and to this end, he disarmed the citizens to make sure there wouldn't be an uprising against him. He did this with a very clever trick. He called all the people together in the Agora, the marketplace, to attend like a public information forum, and he asked them to come there under arms to bring their weaponry. And when they gathered in the Agora, he spoke quietly to them, deliberately quietly, so they couldn't hear, whisper, whisper, whisper. And when they shouted out, "Hey, speak up," he said, "Oh, this is no good. Let's all move to the Agora." And to the Acropolis. And when they shouted out, and when they got up to the Acropolis, he said, "We must not bring our weaponry inside of this place because it is a sacred precinct of Athena, and we must leave all of our weaponry out by the gates." So the people agreed to this, and as they went up to the Acropolis, they put their arms down in the process. Pisistratus then addressed the crowd from the entranceway to the Acropolis, and as he spoke to them, his supporters were busy gathering up all their weapons and locking them away. Just to be on the safe side, and that is just to make sure that the people didn't rise up against him, Pisistratus went everywhere with his own mercenary bodyguard. As for his principal opponents, those were the noble families. Many of these, several hundred in fact, fled into exile. And those families that didn't flee into exile, he took their sons as hostages, and diplomatic hostages. They weren't chained to a basement or something, in a basement, but he deposited them on the island of Naxos, and it was because his friend and ally Legidamus was a tyrant there, and he kept them under, comfortable but nevertheless enforced conditions. So Athens falls under a tyranny. The one thing that the Eupatridae had worked so hard to prevent since the time of Dracon, almost a century earlier. Pisistratus would remain tyrant until his death in 528 BC, when his two sons would take over from him. The Athenian Constitution calls the Pisistratus's rule the Age of Chronos, that is, a golden age in Athens' history. And I would like to show you why that is right now. Pisistratus followed the pattern of the archaic tyrants in other states, which we discussed in lecture number 2, if you remember, by bettering the lifestyles of the people and promoting the city as an economic power. He was concerned with maintaining peace and friendship with other states, in particular Sparta and Megara. In a recent war with Megara, you remember he had helped to capture its port, Nicaea, for Athens. This had created gallons of bad blood between Athens and Megara, and Pisistratus was anxious not to have the already existing tensions escalate. And if you remember, he used his reputation from that war in Megara as the basis for his first attempt at tyranny in 561/560. Peace would mean not merely no more hostilities and hence no need to commit resources elsewhere. It would also mean a chance for the economy to prosper, because with peace, prosperity usually follows. That's probably his greatest claim to fame, actually, the period of peace and prosperity which he brought for Athens when he became tyrant, and which will be the largest span of peace up until that time, really. Pisistratus didn't neglect foreign affairs, though. It wasn't as if he pursued some sort of isolationist policy. For example, he established an Athenian presence in the Thracian Chernus region. This is the modern-day Gallipoli in western Turkey. Gallipoli, believe it or not, is actually is that region right here, and this is a close-up of it. Gallipoli is actually a Turkish corruption of the Greek Kallipolis, that is the beautiful city. As so many Turkish names, place names are actually corruptions of Greek words. The most famous of them is Istanbul itself, which comes from the Greek Istanpolin, into the city, which ultimately became Istanbul. This area, though, of the Chernus region, Thracian Chernus region, this area was of tremendous strategic importance because it was on the grain route from the Black Sea to Athens. And the Athenians were always dependent on imported grain to get by, as we've mentioned many times. As governor in that region, Pisistratus sent a man named Miltiades, who belonged to a rival family, the Philiadae. And this was an excellent way both to get rid of a powerful rival from Athens and also to get somebody in there to do the job. Like that phrase, keep your enemies close. No, you know what it is. Your friends close and your enemies closer. So that's something like what he's doing here. Pisistratus knew that he could build on Solon's economic legislation. He knew he could take Athens, and which was on the road to becoming economically prosperous, and make her even wealthier. But he also knew that he couldn't do this without ending the faction strife that had plagued Athens for generations. That same faction strife that was holding back its economic advancement. And as I've mentioned many times, the three factions that were dominating political life in Athens and which were struggling for the archonship, the men of the plain, the men of the coast, and the men beyond the hills, this faction fighting over these among these groups for the archonship was really focused among those first two groups. The archonship was really between those two. And of course, they had supporters throughout Attica. And so Pisistratus was really trying to bring an end to this factional strife. And by extension, he was trying to limit the power of the aristocrats throughout Attica. To stop the squabbling of the aristocrats by exiling them, as I just mentioned, he seized power in 545, sending a number of noble families into exile, or to try to stop the squabbling by taking their sons as hostages, that wasn't enough, and he knew it. He needed to increase the centralization of Athens itself within Attica. He needed to make the people turn away from the aristocrats in their local areas and look towards Athens, and by extension, of course, towards Pisistratus as ruler. And these two aims, improving the city and the people's lifestyle, combined with ending factional fighting among the aristocrats, these two aims are at the heart of everything he did. They are at the heart of all of his policies. It is a very cunning combination, really, of social, foreign, and religious policies that he enacted. I'm going to walk you through that right now. First of all, the farmers throughout Attica had wanted Solon to redistribute the land. We've talked about this many times tonight. He hadn't done this. And we know that this would have been a bad move anyway, given giving the farmers larger chunks of infertile land was not going to help them anyway. But it is likely that these same farmers, or by now their sons, were pestering Pisistratus to do the same thing. They were saying to him, well, we'll support you if you redistribute the land. Solon didn't do it for us, but you can do it. And Pisistratus may well have promised to do this too, to get their support, but if he had promised the poor land redistribution, he certainly had no intention of following through with it. Instead, he adopted Solon's idea of switching to olive cultivation and also vine cultivation, grapes. But because of the power he now wielded as tyrant, he was able to order the farmers to make this change. That's something that Solon couldn't do. There's a big difference there. Solon had wanted them to change, but they had resisted. And now Pisistratus, in ordering them to do this at the head of his, force with his club bearers, they had no choice. But he did sweeten the deal. I don't want to give the idea that he was some kind of violent despot. He sweetened the deal because he offered them loans to enable them to survive while the olive trees matured. So when the olive trees did mature and they started harvesting the olives and selling them and their oil, then they would have to pay back these loans with interest, and they would pay them back to the state, in other words, to Pisistratus, but he would give them the money to live off of in the meantime. This is a very clever move on his part. The farmers might have grumbled about all this, no doubt, and they might have thought that life was never going to change, but if that's what they thought, they were proved wrong. As a result of Pisistratus' move, which, as I said, grew mostly out of Solon's plan of changing to olive cultivation, Attic land, which was largely unable to grow grain, really came into its own. Olives were found throughout Attica. Olive oil became one of Athens' biggest exports, and it helped to pay for the much-needed import of grain from the Black Sea area. The small farmers prospered, as did Attica overall. And all of this was a far cry from pre-Solonian times when you had the hectameroi in dire straits being sold into slavery even. Now, thanks to Pisistratus, with money in the bank and food on the table, the Athenians were not starving, but they even were prospering. And along with this all came gratitude. Not gratitude, though, not to any aristocratic overlord, not to your eupatridae neighbors, but to Pisistratus himself, because he had bettered their lifestyle. This boom in olive and even vine cultivation set a fire under other sectors of the economy as well. Sectors like pottery production. We've talked about this nexus before. Solon had realized that it was one thing to have oil, but quite another to have pots and container vessels to store this oil, and even wine. He'd encouraged foreign craftsmen to move to Athens with grants of citizenship, but pottery manufacture had begun to increase, but had not really taken off meteorically. There were pots made, but there was no real need for them because the farmers had not really gone over full throttle to olive cultivation. Now, though, thanks to Pisistratus, olives were being grown on a much larger scale, not just larger, but more consistent scale. And this all led to a great need for container vessels, pots, and of one kind or another. And this meant more jobs and more economic stimulation. An offshoot of the basic container production, making these pots to store olive oil and wine, was an interesting one that you might not think immediately, but it was very much connected, and that is artistic advancement. It didn't take long, therefore, before potters and therefore painters began to design more sophisticated and luxury pottery items. And by about 550 BC, the technique known as black figure vase painting appears in Athens. We remember from our first lecture, and also from our the second lecture, this style was first invented by the Corinthians during the Cypselid tyranny. But then black figure style was widely copied throughout the Greek world, and Athens was no exception. Under Pisistratus, though, it would take off and really become its own thing, really come into its own. The most famous Athenian black figure artist was a man named Exekias, and he was patronized by Pisistratus personally. He became very quickly a household name throughout the Greek world. The major difference between Athenian black figure and Corinthian black figure was that the Athenian potters used larger pots, and the Athenian painters painted different scenes on them. Most of the Athenian black figure scenes were mythological, or they harkened back to the days of the Trojan War. Now, as I said previously, in the black figure technique, a figure, whether an animal or human, was drawn in outline on the clay of the pot, and during the firing process, the picture turned black. Finer details were then added to it by some sort of sharp tool. And although this was sophisticated compared to the pottery styles that came before it, remember all that stuff I said in the opening lecture about sub-Mycenaean or geometric pottery, the black figure technique was still relatively crude. For one thing, in a profile of a face in black figure, the individuals tended to be painted in profile, not facing forward. When painters painted a figure on a black figure pot in profile, they painted the eye as a forward-facing eye. So in other words, you look at a figure in profile, and you should be seeing the eye on the side. But in black figure, you have this sort of spooky-looking scene where the profile of the face and the eye is looking forward. It's kind of weird. And that's one particular example of how black figure was not very advanced. It wasn't, certainly nothing like naturalistic. And the other obvious figure, the other obvious drawback to it is that the skin tone was not a natural one, but it would have been black for the figures that are being depicted on there. And that is why, in about the year 530, so this is well into the Pisistratid tyranny. Remember, Pisistratus seized power the third time around in 535, so about 15 years after the third seizure of power, a technique known as red figure vases came into being, red figure painting. And this was pioneered by the Athenians. Once again, the figure, animal or human or whatever, was drawn in outline on the clay of the pot, but the rest of the pot was painted with a sort of gloss that turned black during the firing process. And that part of the pot turned black, but the figure remained the natural color of the clay. It became sort of a reddish, and that's where the name red figure comes from. The finer details, facial features, noses, embroidery on cloth and cloaks and that sort of stuff, were then painted on with a brush rather than being incised with a kind of sharp implement, as was the case with black figure. And this greater care in executing these scenes led to a more naturalistic, softer figure, if you like. You still have mythological scenes on red figure, but also new scenes now become popular. And these would actually even eclipse the number of mythological scenes that are painted. And most of these scenes are from everyday life, particularly, scenes from symposia. That is, these all-night drinking parties that the Athenians were so famous for partaking in. You can read Plato's work called the Symposium, which depicts one such events where men would sit around being entertained by flute-playing girls, as you see here, drinking and discussing literature and philosophy and politics and what have you. And if you look actually at the drinking vessels, this is called a kylix, or in the plural kylikes, and you see how they're held by two fingers, or I suppose if you're feeling saucy by one finger, as appears to be the case here, and you would rest it all on your upper arm like this, and then drink by putting your entire crucked arm up to your lips. And but you see they're kind of almost like flinging them here. There actually was a game called Kotapos, which is the world's earliest drinking game. It was a game where the Greek red wine, as with all kind of red wine, it has lees at the bottom. So these kind of dregs at the bottom, these sort of bits that settle to the bottom of drinking. And the game was that one person would have to call out an object in the room, and the person whose job it was at the time, whose turn it was, would have to take their large kilix and then hurl the lees at the object that was named, whether it was a table or a statue or whatever. You could tell it was pretty kind of wild game in a sense. You're throwing wine lees all around the place. And if you hit it, then you got a point. And if you missed it, then you had to drink an entire kilix of wine, which is a lot of wine, as you can see here. So it's kind of like the ancient version of beer pong, I guess, something like that. And anyway, so you see depictions of these kind of things, no longer just mythological or kind of, high scenes, from literature or something. Now it was from everyday life as well. Scenes of women in the house, even as you can see here, here's a woman playing Kotapos. Okay. Put it all together, it wasn't long before Athens eclipsed Corinth as the leading pottery producer in Greece. And because of this, the individual Athenian and the city benefited. Athenian pottery from the Pisistratid period was found as far afield as Cyprus and Syria in the east, and as far afield as Spain in the west. As a result of all of this, Athens began to acquire a cultural reputation in the Greek world. Just like today, where, if you want to think about elegant dresses or something like that, you think of Paris, or you think of Milan or whatever. So in the late archaic and classical periods, if someone wanted to commission a decorative pot for a special occasion, or to have a, I don't know, conversation piece on the mantle or whatever, you'd have to go and get one. Oh, this is by Exekias, and you could brag about that back in your house. Of course, ornamental ware and specially commissioned pots are still the preserve of the wealthy, even basically nowadays too. But as ordinary people grew richer through trade or through exporting olive oil, they could afford the nicer things of life, and they wanted them, just like today. When people acquire more wealth, they want that plasma TV or that Louis Vuitton bag or whatever the case may be. Now, how much did Exekias charge for a one-off order? We have no idea. They wouldn't have come cheap, though, and by today's standards, they would have, certainly, while not commanding the mega millions of, say, a Monet or a Van Gogh painting, they would definitely have been something. They would have been thousands of dollars. But it's not just pottery that Pisistratus encouraged, but artistic life in general. And this wasn't just because he was a lover of the arts. This was deliberate policy to make Athens the cultural center of Greece. And here he was admirably helped by his second oldest son, Hipparchus. The Athenian Constitution describes Hipparchus as philomusos, that is, a lover of the arts, literally a lover of the muse. But as we talked about earlier, muse in the broad sense of, the different goddesses who preside over the various arts. We find Pisistratus and his sons patronizing foreign poets from all over the Greek world. These poets wrote lyric poetry, which had as its themes not the grand themes of war and fate, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the gods, like Hesiod, but rather everyday affairs, drinking in a symposium, or love, or themes of growing old and enjoying life while you're still young. The best-known poets from all over the world came to live and work in Athens. Far more importantly, as far as their impact on the Greek world went, was that the Pisistratids, speaking of Homer, were responsible for producing the first official text of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the so-called Pisistratid recension, as it's often referred to in scholarship. Homer, as we've talked about many times, was fundamental to any Greek. It was the basis of all education that existed at this time. It was impossible for a Greek not to have heard the Homeric poems at some stage. And Homer would, as I say, always be fundamental for the Greek education. It would become fundamental for Roman education too, and exist all the way on up into the Byzantine period, and in some ways, really until the modern age, when, unfortunately, in the 20th century, it really is the first time in about 2,700 years that a person could be considered educated without ever having read the Iliad and the Odyssey. But be that as it may, the Iliad and the Odyssey, just to kind of explain what I'm going after here, remember I talked about this in lecture one. They were originally the products of oral poetry. That is, they were originally the products throughout the dark ages of Greece, before the Archaic period. They were sung by various different rhapsodes, these wandering bards who wandered across the Greek world, reciting them for large audiences. It is thought over the period of 3 days. Sometimes you could do maybe a third of the Iliad in about 8 hours, and go on, do the next third, and then the next third the next day, and so on, over 3 days. But the result of this was that there were various different versions that came around because of this. No two bards ever did it exactly alike. And of course, these poems would be, they were memorized, but they were not memorized in a strict sense. That, like, if we were ever charged in school with memorizing, say, a sonnet or something like that by Shakespeare, you painstakingly remember every word. It's not like that. It was really oral composition. These bards would sort of make up the tales on the spot out of pre-existing formulas, pre-existing phrases, scenes, plots, and so on, and then be woven together at the creative discretion of the bard himself. And so what that all meant was that while the basic plots remained the same, clearly Troy had to fall. Nobody did a version of it where the Greeks lost, and Odysseus had to get home or something like that. Even though there was all these various different versions, there were certain basic plot lines that were always the same. There was all these different versions. And so what Pisistratus' son Hipparchus seems to have done was to call various rhapsodes together to Athens. And we don't know exactly how this process worked at all, but somehow or another, it is actually a matter of debate among scholars, whether or not writing was originally part of this whole project, how one would have done it. Would a rhapsode, certainly nobody could sit there and write down every word as the rhapsode proclaimed the poem, and yet he would sort of need to get into it in order to be able to get going. You couldn't just sit there and slow down every word. It's very hard to imagine how exactly this process would have taken place, but somehow or another, various different rhapsodes were called together, and the Iliad and the Odyssey, as we have them, basically, they come from this time period. This is when they are officially put down in text as as recorded documents, and it is very much my opinion that they're each the product of a single guiding intelligence. I don't think that the author of the Iliad and the author of the Odyssey are the same person. Most scholars do not think that anymore. But nevertheless, I do think that there is such unity within both of these works that both of them are the product of a single organizing intelligence who took all of this pre-existing material and shaped it together into one enormous masterpiece called the Iliad and another enormous masterpiece called the Odyssey. So now, because of all this, Pisistratus, all of this dovetails very nicely. The official text now of Homer dovetails very nicely with Pisistratus's religious policy, because he also instituted a festival that in the Athenian religious, well, there already had been the biggest festival in the Athenian religious calendar, which was known as the Pan-Athenaia. That is a religious festival in honor of Athena, the patron deity of Athens. It already had existed before Pisistratus, but what Pisistratus now did was to add to this festival, which included processions and sacrifices and dances and that sort of thing, big feasting of the sacrificial meats. What he also included with this was now a Homeric contest to it. You see, the Pan-Athenaia was held roughly in our month of March, so it's springtime, nice time of the year. And there was this big procession, as I said, from the Agora up to the Acropolis, and all the festivities, the sacrifices, massive hullabaloo. What Pisistratus did was to revamp this festival For instance, at the end of the festival, he arranged for the slaughter of 100 oxen. And when these oxen were killed, the meat would be given out to people along with wine. This would be one of the few times during the year when people actually got to eat big, juicy red meat. And they got, of course, it was for free, and all the wine and stuff like that. It would have been a big deal. And he introduced the Homeric recitation to this this competition, this recitation competition to the festival, whereby bards or rhapsodes from all over Greece would come to Athens and would each recite a portion of Homer as part of its competition, and the one that recited the best portion won a wreath. It was a symbolic wreath. This is all that the winners of the Olympic Games ever won too. No money, just the wreath and the kleos, the glory of having won it. Well, word of this contest spread throughout the Greek world. Victory at it was significant and certainly coveted. Any rhapsode worth his salt would go there just to try to win. And if you won, you were something. You were like, it was more than just Dancing with the Stars. It was, your name was famous throughout Greece. We might compare it with the Oscars or something like that. But more importantly, it made Athens this kind of premier cultural hotspot. Something that would only, a tendency that would only accelerate as the years wore on. Pisistratus also created a new festival in honor of Dionysius, the god of wine and fertility. Dionysius was the people's god. He was the one that the farmers prayed to for good harvests. So clearly this festival was intended to appeal to them, that is, to the common people. The festival was called the Dionysia, the city Dionysia, and it was held roughly in our March or April. Every fourth year, it was made into a super-duper affair called the Great Dionysia. Once again, just like the Panathenaea, it included a great procession, sacrifices, the slaughter of oxen, and the meat was to be given to the people along with lots of wine and festivities. Not only a Homeric competition here, but also drama, because it was at the city Dionysia that the genre of tragedy, the play of tragedy as a dramatic genre, was born. It seems that a certain person named Thespis, who gives us our word thespian, was responsible for performing the first tragedy. This is what Aristotle tells us in his Poetics, that there were these original kind of choral dances known as dithyrambs, and at some point Thespis stopped being one of the members of the dithyramb, kind of singing about Dionysius or whatever he was talking about, singing about Achilles, and pretended to be Achilles. And that moment is sort of the beginning of drama in the Western tradition, and it goes right on all up until Hollywood movies to this day. Exactly how this all looked in the very beginning, lots of scholarly ink has been spilled about it, and nobody really knows. The word itself, tragedy, tragoidos, is very unclear to us. It somehow comes from the word for goat, tragos, and ode, which means song. And even in modern Greek to this day, the word for song is actually tragoudi. So interesting, but we don't know what that meant. Was there a sacrifice of a goat? Was the prize a goat? Who knows? But whatever the case may be, you have the Homeric contests in the Panathenaea, the rhapsodes winning their contests of Homeric recitation. Now you have dramatic competitions. And every year at the city of Dionysia, there would be 3 different authors who would put on their plays, and each one of them would put on 3 tragedies and one what is known as a satyr play, kind of a lighthearted, so I don't want to use the word comic play, but it's kind of like that. Comedy is distinguished as a genre because comedy was also performed at a different festival in roughly our January. That is the City Linnaean Festival. So that was when comedies were performed. So as you can see, the calendar year is punctuated in Athens by these cultural religious festivals that tended to have a strong literary quality in them. The satyr play is distinguished from comedy because comedy plays tend to be about politics and they lampoon real people, kind of just like our Saturday Night Live or something like that does. Whereas satyr plays are very lighthearted. They don't tend to go into politics or current affairs or something like that. They have other certain generic conventions that we don't have to go into, but there's only one of them that survives. in any real capacity, and that is the Cyclops of Euripides. If you want to read what that looks like, that's that play. There's also another play which has satiric elements to it. By the way, it is not related. That word satyr play and satiric in that sense has nothing to do with our word satire. Satire comes from a Latin word satura, which does mean to kind of lampoon or pull together politics and cultural commentary and stuff like that. So it's altogether very confusing. But anyway, the point though is that you have all these different religious / literary festivals going on throughout the year. And this all benefited the people and made Pisistratus very popular among them. Pisistratus benefited his people and the city in other ways too. For example, he introduced deme judges. The word deme basically means town, something like zip code. And these were men who traveled around the various towns of Attica, hearing cases and deciding appeals. This system was perhaps akin to the practice during the Middle Ages of having assizes. If you want to look up that word, Assize, and assize is a traveling judge that would go around to the different cantons of, say, medieval England or something like that. And the system here in Athens was set up and was meant to help people who couldn't travel to Athens when they had some appeal or some case that needed to be heard. And so it was in their best interest to have somebody come out to them, and this was beneficial for them. And they would just hear all the cases throughout the whole year at one particular time whenever the judge would show up there. Like other tyrants, Pisistratus introduced a building program in Athens, and this included rebuilding the temple of Athena on the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and also starting work on a huge temple to Olympian Zeus. This was supposed to be his showpiece, and it was massive. We have no idea how big it was because it no longer exists, but it was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Another project that Pisistratus ordered, and again, this was similar to what other tyrants did, was the building of an aqueduct to pipe water into the city. And this really benefited the people because obviously before they had to walk a fair distance to fetch water. There were wells in Athens, but they were privately owned, and guess who owned them? The aristocrats. And they certainly wouldn't let the hoi polloi use them. And so Pisistratus now arranged for water to be piped into the city to various fountains throughout the city. And this made it easier for people to acquire water. He also built a defensive wall around Athens for its protection. And so all of these sorts of things, building projects, better water supply, economic stimulation, cultural events, these were standard, if you like, on the part of the tyrants overall, but they were particularly the hallmark of Pisistratus's reign. And they had a triple function. They improved lives, they made the regime popular, and they also provided jobs for construction. Okay, there must have been a number of people in Athens who were unemployed, and these people might gather close to the city. They might possibly be a danger to an existing regime. You're having a lot of people sitting around doing nothing. That's always a bad thing. So give them jobs to do, and they will have less time to turn any sort of social grumbling into real political problems and discontent. The part where Pisistratus really differed from other archaic age tyrants, by the way, lay in the fact in the way he exploited religion. These festivals, as I mentioned, the Panathenaea, the Linnea, the city of Dionysia, these were part of a deliberate policy to combat local cults throughout Attica. They were meant to attract people to look to the city of Athens. They were meant to help centralize the position of Athens in Attica to combat the influence of the aristocrats in the various areas of Attica. Pisistratus's very careful foreign policy of peaceful relations with other states dovetails into his his economic and religious policies. The idea in all of it was to benefit not only the city and its people economically, but to promote Athens as a cultural and economic power in the Greek world as well. Pisistratus set up Athens as the cultural center. It would remain the cultural center of the Greek world really until the Hellenistic period, when places like Alexandria and Egypt eclipsed it. But even then, of course, Athens remained the center and the place to be the study for philosophy. And even the Romans, when their sons would, if any aristocratic Roman had a son of around your age, college age, or something like that, he would always send his son off to Athens to study philosophy. Cicero did it, Julius Caesar did it, all the famous Romans that you can think of did it. And it's hardly a surprise then that the people liked Pisistratus, and perhaps it is no wonder then that the Athenian Constitution called his rule a golden age. But Pisistratus died ultimately in 527 BC, and the tyranny passed to his sons Hippias and Hipparchus. But this golden age was about to end then, and as we will see in the next lecture, it ended in a most dramatic way that had tremendous consequences for what came afterwards. And another thing I'm going to do in the next lecture is to run one of my kind of variant beliefs here, one of my positions that runs contrary to received wisdom, that by golden age, the Athenian Constitution meant something quite different from how we commonly interpret it, from how I seem to have been interpreting it even in this lecture. But you're just going to have to wait until the next lecture to hear what I'm going to say about it. Thank you so much.